Hey, Katie. We have the Bungalow Mystery, and we are on Chapter 8, The Frightened Runaway. Nancy Drew, Dog Tender. This was a new title, the young detective thought. As she burst into laughter, the two poodles began to yap excitedly and dance around in little circles. "Hello, girls," Nancy said to them, and bent down to pat the friendly animals. She then rang the doorbell with determination. This time the door was opened by a tremendously stout woman whose chubby face was framed by a mass of fuzzy brown curls. "Yes?" she inquired coyly. "Have you some trouble with the babies? I told Colette to give you explicit instructions." Nancy smothered a giggle. "Are you Mrs. Stewart?" she asked briskly. "Of course," the woman said impatiently. Nancy introduced herself and said that a mistake had been made. She was not the dog walker, but had come to solicit Mrs. Stewart's aid for the River Heights Youth Center. "Oh, dear," Mrs. Stewart blushed, obviously flustered. "Colette's made a mistake. I'm sorry." She jerked the leash from Nancy and gave the poodles a loving glance. "Mama will give you both cookies while we wait for your real walker." Nancy cleared her throat, and Mrs. Stewart's glance returned to the collar. "Oh, yes, your project. I'm afraid we'll have to discuss it another time. I'm having an afternoon musicale featuring the most divine violinist, Professor Lebojo. He is expected any moment." "I understand," Nancy nodded. "Perhaps I can return later when Mr. Stewart is home?" "He left today for a fishing trip in Maine," Mrs. Stewart replied. She added somewhat angrily, "I simply don't understand what Gerald. He doesn't appreciate our home life here with the children." Her glance swept toward the poodles. Nancy managed to keep a straight face, said goodbye to Mrs. Stewart, and left. When she returned to her car, Nancy reached the conclusion that Mrs. Stewart was hardly the type to plan a bank swindle. Her poor husband, Nancy thought with a laugh. There was only one more name for Nancy to check today, Mr. Stephen Dowd. She drove out Hilo Street and headed across the city. The man's address was in a business zone, which was partly residential, although most of the homes were two-family dwellings. After a little difficulty, Nancy found the house she sought, a brown duplex situated between a gasoline station and a tailor shop. She parked and went up the walk. Mr. Dowd's half of the house was on the right-hand side. The young sleuth rang the bell and waited. No answer. She pushed the bell again. Still no one came to the door. "Maybe I can find out something from his next-door neighbor," Nancy thought hopefully. As she was about to ring the bell on the left, the door was opened by a young woman, a shopping bag in her hand. She appeared startled to see Nancy. The young sleuth smiled pleasantly. "I came to call on Mr. Dowd," she explained. "He's probably at work." "No, Mr. and Mrs. Dowd are both away now, on tour with a show, they said. They board here. I'm Mrs. Wyman." "Are they entertainers?" Nancy inquired with interest, and explained about the youth center. Mrs. Wyman said the couple were actors, but she did not know what parts they played. "Since moving here 2 months ago, they've been away a great deal of the time." Nancy thanked Mrs. Wyman and said she would call again. "They sound like the type of people I'm looking for to help amuse the children," she explained. Nancy drove away, but told herself they would bear further investigation. It seemed unnatural that they would not have told what parts they were playing. Nancy felt a little discouraged about her findings so far. She realized she could do nothing else until she met Herbert Brown the next afternoon. "I think I'll go home, get my bathing suit, and head for the club," she decided. The day was becoming very warm. 15 minutes later, Nancy parked in her driveway. As she was about to insert her key in the front lock, the front door was opened from inside. Laura Pendleton, wan and disheveled, stared at the young detective. "Laura!" Nancy gasped. She could hardly believe her eyes. "Hello, Nancy," her friend said as Hannah Gruen came into view, walking slowly on her crutches. "Come in, Nancy," the housekeeper invited urgently. "Laura's been waiting for you for over an hour. She's terribly upset." The three went into the living room, and Nancy sat down on the couch beside the visitor. Before Nancy could ask why she was in River Heights, Laura burst into tears. "Oh, I'm so unhappy," she sobbed. "That's why I ran away." Nancy gently stroked Laura's hair and waited for the hysterical girl to calm down. Then she said quietly, "Tell me everything that has happened since I saw you last." Slowly, Laura started to speak. After Nancy and Helen had left the hotel suite, Mr. Aborn said he had to attend to some business for a short while. He had left the hotel. Meanwhile, Laura and Mrs. Aborn had checked out and waited for the guardian in his blue sedan, which was parked in the hotel lot. "Where did Mr. Aborn go?" asked Nancy. "I don't know, but when he met us a short while later, he was carrying a briefcase. As we started toward Melrose Lake, Mrs. Aborn asked what I had done with Mother's jewelry. When I said it was in my handbag, she asked me to give it to her for safekeeping. I said I would when we got home." "Then did you go directly to Melrose Lake?" Nancy questioned. "Yes," Laura replied. She hesitated, then went on with her story. "The Aborns showed me to my room and I started to unpack. I found I needed more hangers," the girl went on. "But when I went to the door to ask Mrs. Aborn for them, I discovered it was locked on the outside." "Locked!" Hannah gasped, and Nancy was shocked. Laura nodded. "I was so frightened," she said, "that at first I didn't know what to do. Then I heard voices coming from the Aborns' room. I lay down on the floor so I could hear them better and listened." Marian Aborn said, "What did you lock her in for? She doesn't know anything." And my guardian replied, "Not yet, but she's a smart kid. See if you can gain her confidence and get a hold of the jewels." As Laura paused, a terrible thought came to Nancy. Were the Aborns thieves? But they could not be, she argued, if Marie Pendleton had trusted the couple to take care of her daughter. And besides, I gather the Donnells think they are nice people. Aloud she asked, "What happened next?" "I thought I must have heard them wrong," the Auburn girl said slowly, "but I suddenly remembered Mother telling me always to take good care of her jewelry. So I took it from my handbag and hid it underneath the mattress of the bed. Just as I finished doing this, the door to my room opened. Mrs. Aborn stood there, looking very friendly. She offered to help unpack my bags and admired several dresses as I hung them in the closet." "And then?" Nancy pressed. Laura said that she and Mrs. Aborn had prepared a tasty dinner, and then she and the couple had watched television for a while. "Just before we went upstairs to bed, Mrs. Aborn said it would be a good idea for me to put my mother's jewels in the wall safe in the living room. I agreed and said I would give them to her in the morning." "What was Mrs. Aborn's reaction to this?" Hannah asked. "Oh, both she and her husband became very angry. They said apparently I didn't trust them to take care of a few insignificant gems, while they in turn had the responsibility of caring for a penniless orphan. Oh, Nancy, I thought Mother had a lot of money. Mrs. Aborn yelled at me and said I was ungrateful and a big burden to them. They were sorry they had ever agreed to take me." "I can't explain how I felt," Laura went on, her hands shaking with nervousness. "I was just numb. Then I burst into tears and rushed to my room." Laura said that finally she had fallen asleep and awakened this morning to find she was again locked in. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Aborn opened the door, acting very friendly, and said breakfast was ready in the kitchen. "Was anything said about last night?" Nancy asked. Laura said no, that the Aborns had acted as though nothing had happened. "But a strange thing occurred after breakfast," Laura stated. "Mr. Aborn took a small package from the refrigerator and left the house, saying he would be back later. Before he went, he said I would be sorry if I didn't cooperate with them." "I presume he meant to hand over the jewels," Hannah guessed, and Laura nodded. "I knew then that I had to leave their house and also get word to Nancy. While Mrs. Aborn was emptying the rubbish, I tried to use the phone, but she caught me and twisted my arm, then hung up the receiver." "You see, I was right, Hannah," Nancy exclaimed, and told Laura her theory about the call. "Were you locked up again?" Hannah asked. Laura explained that before Mrs. Aborn could do this, she had run past her and barricaded herself inside the bedroom, not wanting the jewels to be unguarded. At that moment, the doorbell had rung. Apparently Mrs. Aborn had not answered it, for the woman had kept quiet for a long while on the first floor. "So I took my handbag and jewels and climbed down a trellis outside my window," Laura said. "Once I was on the detour, I was lucky enough to get a ride to the highway, and there I caught a bus to River Heights. I took a taxi to your house." As Laura sat back with an exhausted sigh, Hannah stood up. You're worn out, dear, the housekeeper said. I'm going to get you a cup of hot tea, and you're not to say another word until you've drunk it. With that, she bustled out of the room and returned shortly with a small tray on which a cup of hot tea and a piece of toast. By the time Laura had finished the snack, color had returned to her cheeks, and she looked more relaxed. I wonder if we should report your experience to the police, Nancy mused. What could we tell them? Laura quavered. That's the point, Nancy continued. We could tell them the Aborns tried to get your jewels, but of course they would deny it all. It would be their word against yours. And I don't have definite proof, Laura said dejectedly. Nancy patted the girl's hand. We'll do everything we can to help you, Laura. You've really had a terrible experience, you poor girl. Nancy, you're a real friend, Laura said. Tears came into her eyes. Mr. Aborn is my legal guardian. I saw the papers. But what am I going to do? You'll stay with us, Hannah said quickly, and when Mr. Drew comes home, he'll know how to handle the situation. Nancy was quiet, but she was doing a lot of figuring. Something mysterious was going on at Melrose Lake. She intended to find out for herself what it was.